September 1862. The British Prime Minister writes 7 words in a private letter. Those 7 words nearly destroyed the United States of America. He didn't send troops. He didn't fire a single shot. He wrote, "I agree with you that the time has come." The time had come, in Palmerston's mind, to recognize the Confederate States of America, to break Lincoln's naval blockade by force, to split the United States permanently in two, and hand Britain's greatest strategic rival to history. A cabinet meeting was scheduled. Napoleon III was ready to follow Britain's lead. The Confederacy's diplomats in London were waiting for the telegram that would change everything. That telegram never came. This is the story of how Britain came within 5 days of crushing the United States, and the 5 forces that stopped her. Secret ships, a dying prince, cotton, grain, and a piece of military arithmetic so terrifying that no British general dared say it out loud in public. Stay with me, because the answer will surprise you. Let's start with what most people get wrong. Britain was not a passive bystander to the American Civil War. She was a calculated, self-interested imperial power, watching 2 versions of America go to war, and she had a favorite. A divided United States was, in strategic terms, Britain's dream outcome. 2 weaker, competing American nations. One dependent on British textile markets for its cotton economy, the other dependent on British credit for its industrial expansion, would never threaten British dominance of global trade. Palmerston understood this with the cold precision of a chess grandmaster, and in the autumn of 1862, with Confederate General Robert E. Ndad, Lee routing Union armies in Virginia, and a string of Southern battlefield victories, making Confederate independence look not just possible, but probable, Palmerston moved. September 1862, Palmerston privately wrote to Foreign Secretary Lord Russell that the time had come to offer mediation, a diplomatic word for recognition of Confederate independence. A cabinet meeting was set for October. Only one thing stopped it: news from a single battlefield in Maryland. The Battle of Antietam, September 17, 1862. The bloodiest single day in American military history, 22,017 casualties in 12 hours. Lee's advance into Northern Territory was repulsed. The Union had not been destroyed. And 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln issued a document that changed not just the war, but what the war meant. Palmerston's cabinet meeting was postponed, then quietly cancelled. The 7 words he had written were never acted upon. But the intention behind them, Britain's willingness to crush the United States if the strategic moment presented itself, had been real. And understanding why it failed requires understanding the 5 forces that, together, made British intervention impossible. The South didn't just go to war with the North, it went to war with Britain's stomach. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet had a weapon they believed was unstoppable. Not artillery, not cavalry, cotton. The arithmetic was staggering. Before the war, the American South produced 77% of the 800 million pounds of cotton consumed annually by British textile mills. The industry employed over 500,000 workers across Lancashire and Manchester. Entire cities, Blackburn, Burnley, Preston, lived and died by the arrival of southern bales. Cut that supply, the Confederate leadership calculated, and Britain would face a social explosion. Unemployed workers in the streets, mill owners bankrupt, tax revenues collapsing. Recognition of the Confederacy, they believed, was not a political choice. It was an economic inevitability. By spring 1861, Southern states began burning their own cotton. An estimated 2.5 million bales were destroyed to manufacture the crisis faster. Exports collapsed from 3 million bales in 1860 to almost nothing. Cotton prices on global markets exploded from 10 cents to nearly $2 a pound, a 2,000% increase in 18 months. Manufacturers in Liverpool marched to Parliament. "I would rather be handed down to posterity as the builder of a dozen Alabamas than as a man who applies himself to set class against class." John Laird, MP and Confederate shipbuilder in Parliament, 1863, and then King Cotton unravelled. Because the South had miscounted its cards. In the 2 years before the war, bumper harvests had led British mill owners to stockpile cotton at historically low prices. When the Confederate embargo struck, those warehouses absorbed the first shock. The Lancashire cotton famine, the mass unemployment, the soup kitchens, the children in the streets, arrived too late. The cabinet moment had already passed, and while the South was burning its crop, Britain was quietly diversifying. India, Egypt, Brazil. The empire was not, it turned out, a hostage to one American state's export commodity. The Confederacy had confused Britain's dependence on southern cotton with Britain's dependence on the South. They were not the same thing, and that confusion would cost them everything. The Lancashire cotton famine, 1861 to 1865, threw an estimated 500,000 workers into unemployment or severe poverty. Yet even at its worst, the British cabinet never formally voted to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. The workers who should have demanded intervention instead, as we will see, demanded exactly the opposite. Here is a fact that does not appear in most American history textbooks. While Britain was officially neutral, British shipyards were secretly building the Confederate Navy, and those ships nearly started a war. The man at the center of this shadow operation was James Dunwoody Bulloch, Confederate naval captain, nephew of Theodore Roosevelt, and one of the most effective intelligence operatives of the 19th century. Bulloch arrived in Liverpool in June 1861 with a single mission: procure warships for the Confederacy, using the cover of British commercial law. What followed was 4 years of industrial-scale conspiracy conducted in plain sight on the banks of the River Mersey. His masterpiece was hull number 290, constructed at the John Laird Sons and Company shipyard in Birkenhead, directly across the water from Liverpool. Deliberately built without weapons on British soil, exploiting a loophole in Britain's Queen's proclamation of neutrality. In July 1862, as American Minister Charles Francis Adams frantically gathered evidence and begged the British Foreign Office to seize her, the vessel quietly slipped out of the Mersey on a trial run under a British flag. She never came back. She sailed to the Azores. She was armed by a Confederate supply ship, and she was rechristened with a name that would become infamous on both sides of the Atlantic, the CSS Alabama. The CSS Alabama burned or captured 65 Union merchant vessels over 2 years. She drove American shipping insurance rates to a crippling 10%, causing mass flight of northern commerce to foreign hulls. By 1864, the American merchant share of Atlantic trade had collapsed from over 50% to just 27%. A single British-built ship did more economic damage to the American merchant fleet than any Confederate army. In 1872, an international tribunal ordered Britain to pay the United States $15.5 million in damages. But Bulloch wasn't finished. Even as Adams raged about the Alabama, Bulloch had already contracted with the Laird brothers for something far more dangerous: 2 ironclad rams. At 230 feet long, plated with 4.5-inch iron armor, and fitted with a 7-foot iron spike at the bow designed to sit 3 feet below the waterline, these were not commerce raiders. They were warships built specifically to punch through wooden hulls, to shatter Lincoln's wooden blockade fleet at southern ports, and break the Union stranglehold on Confederate trade. If those 2 ships had reached the Confederacy, the entire strategic picture of the war would have changed overnight. Adams understood this. In September 1863, he sent his most famous diplomatic message to Lord Russell. "It would be superfluous in me to point out to your lordship that this is war." Charles Francis Adams, American Minister to London, September 5, 1863. It was not rhetoric. It was an ultimatum. And as Adams penned those words, the British government had already, quietly, made its decision. Royal Navy warships dropped anchor alongside the two rams in Liverpool docks on October 8, 1863. 2 days later, British customs officially impounded them. The British government, to avoid a second Alabama scandal, simply bought the two rams itself for $220,000 and added them to the Royal Navy. The Confederacy's last naval gamble had failed. November 8, 1861. A United States Navy captain commits an act so reckless that it forces Lord Palmerston to begin his emergency cabinet meeting by throwing his hat on the table. Captain Charles Wilkes of the USS San Jacinto had intercepted the British Royal Mail packet RMS Trent on the open ocean and forcibly removed two Confederate envoys, James Murray Mason, bound for London, and John Slidell, bound for Paris. It was, by any reading of international maritime law, an act of piracy against a neutral vessel. Britain went incandescent. Palmerston's cabinet prepared a war ultimatum. It demanded the immediate release of the Confederate envoys, a formal apology, and an implicit admission of American guilt. 8,000 British troops were dispatched to Canada, traveling through frozen New Brunswick by sleigh in winter, some within rifle shot of American territory in Maine. The Royal Navy began readying its Atlantic squadrons. British generals proposed an invasion of Maine from Canada to occupy Portland and force the Union to divert its armies northward. My verified fact. During the Trent crisis of December 1861, Britain deployed 11,000 additional troops to Canada using 18 transport ships. By the end of December, British forces in Canada stood at approximately 18,000 rund-s against an anticipated American invasion force of up to 200,000. British war planners understood the disparity. They did not like it. War was prevented by a dying man. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, was already gravely ill with what would prove to be typhoid fever. He would be dead within 3 weeks. But on December 1st, 1861, he rose from his sickbed and personally redrafted the British ultimatum, softening its language just enough to allow the Americans to claim they were acting on principle rather than capitulating to British threats. He wrote his last significant public document for the sake of peace. Then he took to his bed and did not rise again. Lincoln, confronted with the choice between releasing the Confederate envoys or fighting Britain simultaneously with the South, chose with characteristic quiet wit, one war at a time. Mason and Slidell were freed on January 3, 1862. The crisis dissolved. Prince Albert died on December 14, 1861. He never knew whether it had worked. September 22, 1862. 5 days after the bloodiest battle in American history, Abraham Lincoln does something no one in London has anticipated. He changes what the war is about. Before the Emancipation Proclamation, the American Civil War could be framed, and was framed, in London, as a constitutional dispute about federal authority and states' rights. Britain had abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, but she had also done business with the slaveholding South for decades, buying its cotton, financing its plantations, ensuring its trade. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation changed all of that. As of January 1st, 1863, all enslaved persons in states still in rebellion would be legally free. Lincoln had reframed the war as a war about slavery, and in doing so, he had made British recognition of the Confederacy morally catastrophic. The British establishment initially recoiled. Lord Russell called it hypocritical. Lincoln was only freeing slaves where he had no power to do so. William Gladstone, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, publicly endorsed Confederate nationhood in a speech in Newcastle in October 1862. The interventionist faction in Palmerston's cabinet reached its peak of influence. But something else was happening in the streets below. In Manchester, the very city where the cotton famine had shuttered mills and emptied wages, the workers who had the most to lose from the war held mass public meetings. And those meetings did not call for intervention on behalf of the South. They passed resolutions praising Lincoln. They refused, on moral principle, to process cotton that might sustain the slaveholders' cause. Workers who were genuinely hungry chose their conscience over their bread. I know and deeply deplore the sufferings which the working people of Manchester and in all Europe are called to endure in this crisis. I cannot but regard your decisive utterances upon the question as an instance of sublime Christian heroism. Abraham Lincoln. Letter to the Working People of Manchester, January 19, 1863. Britain had paid $20 million in compensation to slaveholders, the largest government payment in British history to that point, to abolish slavery in 1833. To formally align with a nation whose own vice president had declared in his cornerstone speech that slavery was the cornerstone of Confederate civilization would have been a moral contradiction of staggering proportions. Any British government that intervened on behalf of the South after the Emancipation Proclamation would have done so against the explicit moral objection of its own working class. It would have been political suicide. The proclamation did not just change the war. It slammed the door on British intervention, and that door could never again be reopened. King Cotton was the weapon the South chose. But there was another weapon, silent, invisible, and far more powerful, that Britain could never afford to ignore. America was feeding her. In the early 1860s, successive crop failures swept across Europe and the British Isles. Britain faced a food security crisis of genuine severity. At precisely that moment, the agricultural states of the Union, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and the vast northern grain belt were producing record harvests. British imports of American wheat and corn skyrocketed. The political calculus in Westminster was suddenly brutal and simple. London could fight to restore Confederate cotton and risk starvation, or it could stay neutral, keep the grain flowing, and feed its restless industrial working class. Richard Cobden, the great free trade politician, put it with his characteristic bluntness in Parliament: it would be cheaper to keep the entire population of the cotton districts on turtle champagne and venison than to send an army to America to seize cotton by force. Richard Cobden, MP in Parliament. 1862. Rhetorical excess. But the underlying arithmetic was sound. The Union held a food monopoly over British survival that nobody was willing to name publicly. War with Washington meant hunger in London, and London understood this even if it never said so out loud. The Confederacy had built its entire diplomatic strategy around one British dependency. It had never looked up to notice the other one. British imports of American grain rose dramatically during the Civil War years. Between 1861 and 1865, the United States supplied a substantial portion of Britain's wheat imports at a time of European crop failure. Some historians argue that without American grain, British urban food prices would have risen to socially destabilizing levels, potentially triggering civil unrest of the kind that British governments of the 1860s feared above almost anything else. Strip away the cotton, the grain, the moral arguments, and the diplomatic calculations, and you arrive at the coldest truth of all. Britain's generals were afraid, not of America's navy, of America's army. Yes, the Royal Navy was supreme. A war with Britain would have devastated Union commerce. British warships could have blockaded American ports from Halifax to New Orleans, swept merchant ships from the Atlantic, bombarded Boston and New York from the sea. The economic damage would have been severe and real. But war was not a naval exercise. and Britain's generals knew it. By late 1862, the Union Army was one of the largest and most battle-hardened military forces on Earth, forged in 2 years of industrialized slaughter. Those men did not need ships to reach Canada. They needed roads and railroad lines, and they had them. The Union Army could march north and overwhelm the thin British garrison in Canada, fewer than 20,000 men against a potential American force of 200,000, long before any reinforcement could cross the Atlantic. A war with Britain would almost certainly have resulted in the American conquest of Montreal, Toronto, and Quebec. Canada was not simply a strategic concern, it was a hostage. British war planners proposed an invasion of Maine from Canada during the Trent Affair, but they also acknowledged that the Union, if fully mobilized, could field 50,000 to 200,000 troops against Canada, against a British garrison force of fewer than 20,000. The disparity was, in military terms, catastrophic. British generals understood this. Palmerston understood this. But no one was willing to say it publicly. Britain could devastate the American economy from the sea. The United States could erase the British Empire from the North American continent by land. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow without suffering an existential one in return. It was, as historians would later call it, a 19th century form of mutually assured destruction. Lord Palmerston, for all his bluster and bellicose table-thumping, understood this arithmetic with perfect private clarity. Every time he reached for the sword, Canada reminded him why he should put it back. 5 forces had created the conditions for restraint, but 5 forces do not enforce themselves. For that, you need people. Extraordinary people, operating under almost unbearable pressure. Lord Lyons, the British ambassador to Washington, was perhaps the most important of them. A bachelor workaholic who cultivated an almost theatrical stillness amid chaos, Lyons kept his diplomatic channels open through every crisis of the war. During the Trent Affair, he delivered Britain's ultimatum to Secretary of State Seward with exactly the right combination of steel and courtesy, firm enough to be credible, measured enough to allow Washington a dignified exit. He privately urged caution to London while making clear to the Americans that he was utterly serious. He was the brake on a runaway carriage. Charles Francis Adams, the American minister to London, was his counterpart in precision and nerve. Son of one president, grandson of another. Adams arrived in London in May 1861, one day after Britain's declaration of neutrality was issued, and spent the next 4 years in a state of permanent, controlled fury. His most consequential battle was against the Laird Rams. When Russell initially refused to seize them, Adams sent his "This is War" letter and waited. He was, as one biographer noted, pushing on an open door. Palmerston had already decided to act, but it was Adams's relentless pressure that had made the cost of inaction politically impossible for the British government. And then there was Sir George Cornewall, Lewis, the British Secretary for War, who, in November 1862, at the precise moment Gladstone's interventionist faction was at its most powerful, delivered a memorandum to the Palmerston cabinet that systematically and devastatingly demolished every argument for intervention. The legal complications, the military risks, the impossibility of enforcing any mediation the Union rejected. The memorandum was dry, precise, and lethal. It killed the interventionist case inside Whitehall with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Political passion died under the weight of bureaucratic logic. 3 men. 3 different methods. One outcome. By the spring of 1863, the question was settled, not with a single decision, not with a grand proclamation, but through the slow, grinding accumulation of 5 forces that together made British intervention not merely unwise, but impossible. King Cotton had found alternative suppliers. The grain that nobody spoke of had locked London into a dependency it dared not break. The Emancipation Proclamation had made intervention a moral obscenity in the eyes of the British public. The Union Army had made Canada a hostage that neutralized the Royal Navy's reach, and a handful of extraordinary individuals, Lyons, Adams, Lewis, and a dying Prince Albert, who rose from his sickbed one final time, had ensured that no single crisis was allowed to spiral past the point of return. Britain had not crushed the United States, not because she lacked the Navy, not because she lacked the will, but because the price of crushing it was a price no sane empire could afford to pay, and because the South's great gamble, King Cotton, had rested on the assumption that Britain's stomach could be controlled by one commodity, when in truth it was controlled by another. The Civil War ended in April 1865. The United States emerged exhausted but whole. Britain emerged having preserved her most important transatlantic relationship, having kept Canada, and having quietly acquired 2 ironclad warships for £220,000 that she had been embarrassed into buying from a Confederate agent. In 1872, she paid $15.5 million in damages for the ships she had let slip, a remarkably cheap price, historians would later calculate, for the privilege of having stayed out of a war she might have started. The Confederacy recalled its ambassador from London in autumn 1863 in furious protest. Jefferson Davis, who had staked his nation's independence on King Cotton, died in 1889 having never acknowledged the error. The South had misread Britain's needs, misread Britain's morality, misread Britain's military exposure, and misread Britain's stomach. It had, in short, misread everything. The greatest victories in history are sometimes the wars that were never fought. Britain's restraint was not weakness. It was perhaps the most strategically sophisticated decision the British Empire ever made. As the 20th century would demonstrate, in 2 world wars fought side by side, in the Atlantic Charter, in the intelligence partnerships that define the modern world, the decision Britain made in those 4 tortured years of the 1860s was the foundation of everything that came after. The special relationship was not born on the beaches of Normandy. It was saved, quietly and at enormous cost, in the smoke-filled offices of Whitehall, in the frozen dispatches of the Canadian winter, and in the private conscience of a dying German prince who rewrote 1 letter and went to bed for the last time. History rarely turns on the dramatic. It turns, far more often, on the letters that were softened, the ships that were seized, the grain ships that crossed an ocean in silence, and the men who understood, when no one else did, that the greatest service a statesman can perform is to find his adversary a dignified way out. The war Britain chose not to fight shaped the world you live in today. If that matters to you, subscribe to Britain at War, leave a comment, and stay with us, because episode 2 is the story they buried even deeper.